Thank you again to Dr. Nadir and Dr. Zul for being with us. And this afternoon we are going to discuss about Islamism, post-Islamism, and civil Islam. So I think I'll just put a few definitions on the board, and perhaps then we can discuss about it. Basically, Islamism refers to those ideologies and movements that strive to establish some kind of an Islamic order, a religious state, Sharia law, and moral codes in Muslim societies and communities. I believe Dr. Zul would agree with me. The Islamist insistence on holding state power derives from the doctrinal principle of al-amru bil ma'ruf wa nahyu anil munkar, command right and forbid wrong. As a consequence, the Islamist normative places more emphasis on people's obligations rather than their rights. People are perceived more as dutiful subjects than are rightful citizens. Right, Dr. Joe? All right, now we go to post-Islamism, which is, very famous terminology nowadays, especially with the Arab Spring. Right, so I believe that the first person who coined was not Oliver Roy, but Asif Bayat, who said that post-Islamism refers to a political and social condition in which, after a phase of experimentation, the appeal, energy, and sources of legitimacy of Islamism get exhausted. Even among its once ardent supporters, Islamists become aware of their system's anomalies and inadequacies as they attempt to normalize and institutionalize their rule. So Islam, in post-Islamism, Islam is no longer a solution to all problems, or what Dr. Zul mentioned just now, al-Islam huwa al-hal, right? So the project of post-Islamism initially represents an endeavor to fuse religiosity and rights, faith and freedom, Islam and liberty. Hence, these innovative discourses demanded the true meaning of democracy, individual rights and tolerance and gender equality, as well as separation of religion from the state. And we come to the third discussion, which is on civil Islam, which is basically an alternative understanding where Islam isn't corrupted or transformed into a political ideology, nor is it state-centric. I believe some of us who have read this Robert Hefner, he wrote the book on civil Islam. It's a very good book for you to read as well and understand what civil Islam is all about. The main focus of civil Islam is on the spiritual development of individual Muslims and the promotion of the general conditions for human flourishing, including a robust civil society, religious freedom, peace, ethics, social justice and economic development, the rule of law, and so on. Civil Islam is very critical of anti-religious secularist ideologies, or what is known as laicite or laicism. But it is not threatened by the Anglo-Saxon understanding of secularism, and in fact, it embraces this form of religious modernity. In this perspective, so long as core human rights, and especially freedom of religion and expression, are ensured, then there are no grounds of revolutionary need for seeking an Islamic state. So with this understanding of the basic definition of Islamism, post-Islamism, and civil Islam, we can have a more intense discussion on topic. And to start the discussion on, I would like to invite upon Dr. Nadir Hashimi. Yeah, thank you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you everyone for coming back to the afternoon session. I want to look at the case of Tunisia in my remarks, and particularly focusing on the post-Islamist transformation among Tunisia's leading Islamist party, Ennahda, in the context of Tunisia's democratic transition, and with specific reference to the role that religion is playing in terms of advancing the cause of democracy in Tunisia today. Religion matters for the development and the consolidation of democracy in three important ways that is relevant to what's happening in Tunisia today and in the broader Arab Islamic world, and I would also argue including here in Malaysia. First, The first point is that in the historical development of democracy on a global level, democratically negotiating the proper role of religion in a new emerging political system is an inevitable part of the process of the path to creating a just political order. This applies especially to those societies where religion is a key marker of identity and thus a highly politicized topic of debate. Alfred Stepan, who I introduced to you this morning, has argued convincingly that all emerging democracies face political conflict and struggle over the normative role of religion in politics. No democracy is immune from this dispute, and any objective reading of history and the development of democracy will reveal that for many long-standing Western democracies, a major dispute was precisely over the role of religion in politics. Stepan, who is critical of a non-historical approach to the study of democracy, has shown in his writings that virtually no European democracy now has a rigid or hostile separation of church and state. Instead, most Western democracies have arrived at a democratically negotiated freedom of religion from state interference, and all of these countries allow for religious groups freedom not only to private worship, but to organize in civil society and to advance their interests in the public realm. It is in this dynamic of what I called this morning, quoting from Stepan, the twin tolerations, where the state institutions on the one hand and religious authorities on the other learn to respect certain minimum boundaries of freedom of action, that an understanding of the relationship between religion and democracy must be rooted. Given this enveloping context, I think what is happening in Tunisia today is both very natural and normal. And what I'm meaning by that, what is happening in Tunisia today, the debate that's happening in Tunisia over the role of religion in government, the very controversies that have taken over Tunisian politics when they came to write their constitution. One of the most, hotly contested and deeply divisive issues was over the role of Islamic law, Sharia. It's somewhat past, but it was a very hotly and contested moment. The public debate on the role of religion in politics is part of the growing pains of a mature and stable democracy. Rather than sounding the alarm and decrying this state of affairs, from the perspective of the history of democratization, this aspect of Tunisian politics should actually be encouraged and celebrated. Those hardline secularists in Europe and in Tunisia and parts of the Arab Islamic world who think differently on this topic need to overcome their historical amnesia about the long history and development of democracy. Doing so will better help them sensitize them and their followers to events that are taking place in Tunisia today. And I think there's lessons here also for the case of Malaysia. The second reason why religion matters for democracy is related to an argument that I made in a book that Farouk read and led to my invitation here, a book that I wrote, my first book called Islam, Secularism, and Liberal Democracy Toward a Democratic Theory for Muslim Societies. I argued in that book that the road to democracy, whatever twists and turns it makes along the way, cannot avoid passing through the gates of religious politics. Let me just restate that because I think it's central to my presentation. The road to democracy, whatever twists and turns it might make along the way, cannot avoid passing through the gates of religious politics. I meant several things by this statement. One point, I argued, was that religious-based political parties, religious intellectuals and activists, could play a critically important role in the democratization of their societies, provided that they reconciled their political theologies, their political ideas, their religious ideas with universal standards of human rights and basic standards of democracy. We can clearly see this happening in Tunisia today, where the leading Islamist party in Ennahda has taken on this task. As the only truly national party, with support throughout the country, they are really at the vanguard of overseeing Tunisia's democratic transition. Their leadership role is unique and critically important to the success of the transition process, and I would argue that no other political party could play the role that Ennahda is performing with respect to advancing the cause of democracy in Tunisia today. And this raises the question, however, as to why Ennahda's contribution to Tunisia's democratic transition is so important and unique. The story really begins with the post-colonial state in the Arab Islamic world and the very brutal and destructive legacies and the traumatized populations that were left in their wake. I talked about this in my remarks this morning, but what I'm really referring to here is the very traumatic and difficult experience with the process of modernization and the question of secularism that was introduced into the Arab Islamic world. As I said this morning, it's important to appreciate that the process of modernization in Europe was largely an internal indigenous process. It was a gradual process. It evolved in conjunction with growing and changing socioeconomic and political developments that were critically supported by intellectual arguments and also supported by religious groups that came to support sort of a process of political secularization. And this gradually sunk deep roots within European political culture. By contrast, in the case of the Arab Islamic world, there was a very different experience. And secularism has been marked by a perception of it being an alien, foreign ideology, closely associated with atheism and imposed on the outside by colonial powers and then by, local elites who came to power in the post-colonial order. And so in the case of Tunisia, you had a very similar process. Tunisia was a former French colony. After the War of Independence in 1956, you had these very secular post-colonial elites in the figure of Habib Bourguiba, who was sort of a mini version of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who came to power. He was in power until 1987, until Zain al-Abidin Ben Ali comes to power, who basically continued on with his policies. Very, very secular, very authoritarian, very repressive, very undemocratic. And so you have this situation where over the course of, the 20th century, as we get to the, beginning of the 21st century, many of these secular post-colonial states in the Arab Islamic world were basically failures. They were economic failures, they were political failures, and this further sort of impugned the reputation of secularism because many of these regimes, particularly in the case of Tunisia, were openly secular in terms of their ruling ideology. Because of that relationship with colonial France, because of the close proximity culturally between Tunisia and France, there was a particular sort of secular French legacy that was left over. And this had very drastic effects on Tunisian society and led to a number of very sort of, I think, destructive results. One of the key legacies of the failure of these post-colonial secular Arab states, of which Tunisia is one of them, was that these societies have been brutalized, traumatized, and deeply internally polarized. This polarization is a direct result of the top-down, authoritarian, secularizing policies of the state that were internalized and accepted by a very small percentage of the population, mostly those living in affluent urban areas, but rejected by vast majority of, in this case, Tunisian society. The absence of a democratic public sphere in Tunisia contributed to this polarization. And this is how the political landscapes looks across many other Arab societies. Due to this legacy of failed secular modernization policies and paradigms, there exists deep distrust and suspicion between different political and ideological camps in Tunisia that revolve around and that are polarized against the backdrop of a secular versus religious/Islamist axis. That's the key fault line in Tunisia today. A secular camp deeply sort of internalizing French secular values, living mostly in Tunis and in the affluent areas, and a significant portion of society that is religiously oriented and that is sympathetic to the policies of the Ennahda party. Adding to this polarization is the shocking rise of also a new development in the context of the Arab Islamic world, the rise of a new ultra-conservative, Saudi-inspired Salafist movement. In the aftermath of the Arab Spring revolutions, this development is playing a significant new role in terms of shaping the politics of these countries. And they pose, this Salafist sort of movement now poses a serious challenge to the prospects of democratic transitions in Arab societies, including in the case of Tunisia. Thus, the tension that we are seeing between Islamists and secularists in Tunisia is not the only tension. There's a new variable, a third player that is playing now an increasingly more vocal role, adding to the polarization of society, and that's the rise of this ultra-conservative Salafist movement. In this context, it should be pointed out that neither of these camps, neither the secularists, neither the Islamists, are monolithic camps. There are deep divisions within each of them. The process and prospects for electoral politics suggest that these camps are in the process of transforming and evolving into different directions. One of the challenges facing Tunisia and other Arab societies is how to overcome the deep polarization that exists between secularists and Islamists, and how to keep the democratic train on track. One answer to this question is that societies that are deeply polarized, in order to overcome deep moments of possible breakdown, is the need for a mediating group that can bring and reduce the level of polarization in society. Such a group can try to reconcile political tensions, find common ground, and morally isolate the non-democratic elements in society who seek to use violence and who seek to subvert the democratic and democratization process. In other words, the creation of a political constituency that can hold the moderate center is needed, where both religious and secular groups can come together under a broad democratic agenda based on a set of universal principles. One of the basic theories of politics put forward by Aristotle centuries ago is the theory of the middle class, and how that theory of a middle class is linked to the development of democracy. According to Aristotle, a large, prosperous middle class can mediate between the rich and the poor, creating structural foundations upon which a democratic political process may operate. The middle class, according to this theory, are less apt than the rich or the poor to act unjustly toward other citizens. A constitution based on the middle class is a middle road between the extremes in society, ruled by the rich and, on the other hand, by the poor. That the middle constitution is best is evident, Aristotle observed, for it is the freest from factional conflict. Where the middle class is numerous, there is the least amount of factions and divisions among citizens, he said. Political systems where the middle class is strong, therefore, are more stable, tend to be more just, and more secure than other forms of government. Beyond Aristotelian theory, the specifically commercial nature of the middle class is also believed to be very important. This is because the democratic institutions that deal with law, power limitation, and electoral participation were staffed and run by, historically, a commercial middle class. More recently in the 20th century, there was a very influential book written by the prominent political sociologist at Harvard, Barrington Moore, called The Social Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy. And he made a very similar point, that the middle class was a key historical actor in a process that ultimately leads to democracy. Moore, for example, emphasized the importance of the bourgeoisie, but broadly construed this to include what we refer to today as the middle class. He suggested that only societies with a sufficiently strong bourgeoisie could become democratic. In societies where landowners were strong, the emerging bourgeoisie had to enter into an alliance with them, which could then often lead to dictatorship. And he summarized his book with the following formula: no bourgeoisie, no democracy. Now, Ennahda, I think, is performing today and has performed the role of this mediating middle class in the context of Tunisia's post-Ben Ali democratic transition. The Ennahda party is perfectly situated to play this role as a mediating group during Tunisia's democratic transition for the following reasons. As one scholar has noted, the rise of new forms of radical Islam in the form of Salafism, most of whom have very deep and antithetical views toward human rights and democracy, has forced Ennahda to change its outlook. To its credit, Ennahda has taken the wise and pragmatic decision to play a mediating role between secular forces on the one hand and Salafist forces on the other. According to one scholar, this is the most interesting aspect in terms of Ennahda's strategy in a new political landscape. What we are witnessing in Tunisia is the capacity of a political party to mediate between different polarities. The role that Ennahda is playing could be crucial and has been crucial in terms of advancing Tunisia into a new political direction. What we are witnessing, therefore, in Tunisia today is the capacity of a political party to mediate between groups of actors who have an interest in derailing the democratization process. The role that Ennahda is playing is absolutely crucial in the context of a new Tunisia, where several political and social actors having deeply ideological divisive worldviews, vying for supremacy, are now at loggerheads, and at one point were threatening to tear down the entire system. What's so interesting about this development is that, historically speaking, Islamist parties in the Arab Islamic world were never mediators. They were always part of the political landscape and considered to be one of the poles that were responsible for creating political tension. On the contrary, the Islamist factor in politics in Tunisia has been portrayed, during the lead up to the Arab Spring as a destabilizing factor by some political participants. But in the new political landscape after the Arab Spring, old actors are performing new roles. The sudden emergence of the Salafists as a new, visible, and increasingly important political and social actor has resulted in an almost redefinition of Ennahda's role in Tunisian politics. Although some scholars think that the mediating role of Ennahda is only tactical in order to avoid confrontation that could serve the interests of the secularist camp, Ennahda is the only actor, I would argue, that's able to communicate and mediate with the Salafists, while at the same time able to mediate and negotiate with more moderate secular forces within Tunisian society. It should be stressed that no other Tunisian political party or movement can perform the role, the mediating task, that Ennahda has currently been performing. It is primarily for this reason why the prospects for Tunisia's democratic transition are largely dependent upon Ennahda's ongoing stewardship of the Tunisian revolution and the democratic transition that is currently underway. If you remove Ennahda from the equation, as some people have been hoping would take place, I would argue the entire house of cards is prone to collapse, and the democratization process in Tunisia would come to a crashing halt. Now, in light of this leadership role that Ennahda has been taking on during the democratization transition process, in particular its role as a mediator in terms of situating itself in the middle of Tunisia's political system, this suggests that the party itself has undergone a political transformation. The sociologist Asif Bayat has described this phenomenon as post-Islamism. In his formulation of post-Islamism, he defines it as a movement and a trend that is not anti-Islamic, nor is it secular. A post-Islamist movement dearly upholds religion, but also highlights citizens' rights and tries to reconcile faith with freedom, Islam and liberty, religiosity with rights. It aspires to create a pious society within a democratic state. In many ways, post-Islamism is undermining the very principles of early political Islam in the 1960s and 70s by emphasizing rights over duties, plurality instead of a single authoritative voice, an ethical reading of religious texts instead of a fixed and harsh reading of religious texts, emphasizing the future instead of the past. Post-Islamists want to marry Islam with individual choice and freedom, with democracy and modernity, to achieve what some people have called an alternative path to modernity. Early examples of such movements of post-Islamism include the reform movement in Iran in the late 1990s and the current Green movement that is repressed in Iran today, Indonesia's Prosperous and Justice Party, Egypt's Hezbollah Wasat Party, Morocco's Justice and Development Party, and Turkey's ruling Justice and Development Party. Each originally began as a hardline political Islamist party, but over time they underwent a gradual internal transformation and came to critique the excesses of previous Islamist rule and practices and ideology, particularly with respect to the role of religion in public life and the question of democracy and how sometimes religion has been used to sanctify political power. All of these groups that were formerly considered to be Islamist eventually opted to work within the framework of a democratic state when given the opportunity to do so. And I think recent developments in Tunisia leading up to the Tunisian Revolution and its aftermath suggests that Ennahda is well on the path to a post-Islamist direction if it hasn't arrived there already. Now, what's interesting about events in Tunisia today from the perspective of Islamic political theory is that this confirms an earlier theoretical claim that I made in 2009, that the path to democracy in Muslim societies will not be led by secularist or liberal forces, but rather it is reformed Islamists or post-Islamists in Asaf Bayat's formulation that could play a leading role in advancing the project of democracy in the Islamic world. This development, I think, is extremely important because it challenges one of the received wisdom on political progress and democratization that Western social scientists and intellectuals subscribe to. Over the past 5 years before the Arab Spring, political scientist Vali Nas noted that this trend was already in place in countries such as Turkey and Indonesia. In an important essay called The Rise of Muslim Democracy, Vali Nas argued that since the early 1990s, political openings in a number of Muslim-majority countries, all admittedly outside of the Arab world, have seen Islamic-oriented but not Islamist parties vying successfully for votes in Bangladesh, Indonesia, Pakistan, Turkey, and Malaysia. He perceptibly noted that unlike Islamists with their visions of rule over Islamic law or even a restored caliphate, Muslim Democrats view political life with a pragmatic eye. They tend to reject or at least discount the classical Islamist claims that Islam commands the pursuit of a Sharia state, and their main goals tend to be more mundane, one of crafting viable electoral platforms and stable governing coalitions to serve individual and collective interests, Islamic as well as secular, within a democratic framework whose boundaries they respect, win or lose. Recent events in Tunisia now conform to these developments and are also occurring in other parts of the Arab world when given the opportunity to do so. These are both noteworthy and profoundly important, as they should, I think, be welcomed by democratic forces around the world. I would also argue that the Brotherhood, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, was also along this path of transformation, of engaging with sort of a set of new challenges when they came into power in 2012. I would argue that had the process of democratization not been subverted by the Egyptian military in alliance with secular and liberal forces, that the Muslim Brotherhood probably would have had to face a number of serious challenges which would have resulted in their rearticulation, reformulation of their political agenda, and eventually a post-Islamist turn. We'll never know whether that happened because of the coup d'etat that took place last summer. I think the above analysis highlights a third way that religion is tied to democratization. At both the level of theory and practice, the debate on the role of religion in politics and the leading role that some reform-minded religious actors are performing in advancing democratization reminds us that the struggle for democratization in Muslim societies is deeply tied to this religious political interaction. While similarities exist in the history and in the development of democracy in the West, this development of the relationship between religion and politics working itself out took place in Europe over a much longer period of time and a very different international context. While in the case of the Arab Islamic world, these developments of trying to resolve the tensions between religion and politics are taking place much more recently, historically, and in a very different international context. So in conclusion, as I've tried to demonstrate in this talk, I think religion profoundly matters in the context of democratization theory. The case of Tunisia is a perfect illustration of why and how religion, properly understood and interpreted, is an important factor in the process of democratic transition and consolidation. The following 3 points are worth emphasizing in the context of emerging debates on Islam and democracy after the Arab Spring. Number 1, the history of democracy involves debates and political conflict over the normative role of religion in politics. This is natural, this is normal, this is to be expected from the perspective of history. Number two, the road to democracy in Muslim societies will be led by reformed Islamist groups, post-Islamists, not secular and liberal forces. This is deeply tied to the traumatic history and the failure of the post-colonial state in the Arab Islamic world. My students in the United States do not understand this argument when I first introduce it to them, because they tend to think that, look, politics in the Islamic world should behave in the same way that politics works in the United States and Canada. That liberal and secular forces are the good guys, religious forces are the bad guys, and if you upend that equation, then you upend our entire understanding of the world. But as we've seen in the case of Egypt, we've seen in the case of Turkey, that often secular and liberal forces within the Islamic world are not the most democratic. In fact, in many ways, they have deep anti-democratic sort of points of view. And we saw this in the case of what happened in Egypt over the last 3 years since the ouster of Mubarak, where at the end of the day, the very destructive role that Egyptian liberal and secular forces played in allying themselves with the military to overthrow the Muslim Brotherhood has created a huge disaster in Egypt, one that I'm not sure Egyptian society will soon recover from. And finally, the third point, in Muslim societies, the process of democratization and the advancement of human rights cannot be artificially delinked or separated from debates about the normative role of religion in government. These two go hand in hand. They're deeply intertwined and interconnected for reasons that are, I think, fundamentally related to the unique history of Muslim societies, both in the pre-modern era and in the modern era, where different lessons have been passed down to the Islamic world that are very different from how people in the West view the role of religion in political life. And so for all of those three reasons, I think Tunisia, I think, is on the right track. Tunisia has come a long way. The Arab Spring began in Tunisia, and sadly, the only place where it really survives today is in Tunisia. All of these openings that occurred and gave us a lot of optimism 3 years ago have been closed, largely because the old regimes, led by the old, deeply entrenched deep states, financed and fueled and supported by Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, are now subverting the process of democracy in the Arab Islamic world. The West has basically stood on the sidelines and now have embraced the old dictators, and it's a very dark picture. The only sort of hope, the only ray of light, the only case of optimism that I can see in the Arab Islamic world is in Tunisia, and I think there's lessons there that one can study that can apply to other Muslim societies such as Malaysia. Thank you.